Hello, pretty.
Names is for tombstones, baby.
That is not my dog.
Welcome to this episode of The Good, the Bad and the Odd with your host Mark. For this episode I'll be discussing the Hammer film from the 70s, Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter.
Didn't I mention it? We're vampire hunters, professional vampire hunters.
Captain Kronos was made in 1974, towards the tail end of Hammer's success. It was one of their last gasps. They obviously put a lot of what they did with this was try and put a lot of new ideas. They're coming up with almost an alternative vampire mythology, which is quite cool. I think to try and break away from Dracula as their sort of mainstay, which they've kind of done already with what's called the Constantine trilogy, which is Twins of Evil, Lust for a Vampire and Vampire Lovers. And sometimes this film's actually considered part of that, number 4 in a trilogy, because there's a mention that one of the main vampires in it is a member of the Constantine family, which is the vampire family antagonist in those other films. And it's kind of interesting. I've seen this film quite a few times. I hadn't picked that up before, so it was kind of interesting to pick up. Anyway, it stars the main character, Captain Kronos, is played by Horst Janssen, who looks the part. In fact, he looks like a kind of swashbuckling Bjorn Borg, but he hasn't got that much charisma, and I think that sunk this, I have to say. There's a few other people that you might know. Caroline Munro, who's famous for being like a poster girl, but she's also made it big in some films. Golden Voyage of Sinbad she was in. Spo Love Me she was in. She was the one who flew the helicopter that James Bond fired a rocket out of the sea and blew up. And she was also the lead character in a really interesting camp sci-fi film called Star Crash. She played Stella Starry. That was quite not a bad film at all, actually. Good fun. And this was also directed by Brian Clemens, who made a lot of, or was the creative force behind the original Avengers series. That's the Avengers with Steed and Emma Peel and stuff like that, not Marvel Avengers. And there was a lot of good ideas in that series, and he brought a lot of good ideas to this, I think.
You see, Doctor, there are as many species of vampire as there are beasts of prey. Their methods and their motive for attack can vary in 100 different ways.
I really like this. I can see why it didn't succeed. It must have come across as dated when it was released. There was films out like The Exorcist. Night of the Living Dead was out 6 years before this. Exorcist was out the year before. There's Rosemary's Babies. There's a lot more modern horror films. Hammer couldn't really compete at this point. And must have looked dated, but I kind of like some of the stuff in it. What I do like is they're vampire hunters. They're professional vampire hunters. They know all sorts of vampire lore. They know all tricks. They present a view of vampires as being not just one thing, lots of different types of vampires, each with their own sort of ways of feeding, each with their own ways of having to be killed. In this, for example, the vampires walk around in daytime, which was also part of the other movies I mentioned, Constantine lore.
What he doesn't know about vampirism wouldn't fill a flea's codpiece.
Constantine family, being able to move around in daylight was one of their things, as opposed to Dracula, who can't. And there's all sorts of interesting other things. For example, we find out that Kronos was actually bitten by a vampire but survived it, and he had to kill his own family who had turned into vampires. It was them that tried to bite him. So he's got a real hatred of vampires. And there's some cool stuff, like they come up with kind of absurd ideas, which I'm sure they just created for this, such as if you lay out dead toads and a vampire passes over it, the toads will come back to life, which is kind of interesting.
If a vampire should be strode close to the grave of a dead toad, then the vampire life shall give, and suddenly the toad shall live.
And it's fun to watch. Also, one other thing about this film is, I could be wrong, but I think this might contain the first instance of a kind of a montage of preparation. It's not quite a montage because it's just one scene, but there's obviously a preparation scene that reminds you of stuff like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando, you know, putting black paint on himself and zipping up his tunic full of bombs and stuff like that. In this sort of there's a bit where Kronos is just standing there and his assistants, helpers, and he's got his own little version of Q in this, who's got all the tricks, you know, loads about vampires. And they, you know, he's standing there and they put on a cross on him, and then they paint red crosses around his neck, especially over the original vampire bite. Then they put garlands of garlic around his arms, and then he's presented with this sword. One of the things in this is they have to try and figure out how to kill these vampires, because not all vampires die the same. And they figure out steel, which I've never heard in any other film or story or anything like that. Steel is what kills these vampires. So he has a specially made sword of steel to fight them. And I would have thought at this day and age all the swords would have been made of steel, but there you go. They made him a special sword.
Time to make our move, my friend. Time to kill a vampire.
There's some cool stuff. There's another cool section which is kind of cheesy but kind of fun, whereas their friend becomes a vampire, and you know, he's one of the vampires they're trying to kill. So they try killing him in various methods, and nothing seems to be working. That stake through the heart doesn't work. They hang him, that doesn't work. And there's all sorts of things until they accidentally figure out that it's steel that kills him, which is kind of fun.
I know you've got guts, Kronos. I've seen them.
And there's some nice touches. He's a cool dude, this Kronos, but unfortunately, as I say, didn't have good charisma. And I was trying to think who was around at that time that would have been good. And I thought about maybe Ollie Reed, but I think he'd been too big and too sort of have too much of a presence in this film, and he'd just make it quite disjointed and odd. So the other one that occurred to me was Ian Ogilvy, who was quite good as the romantic lead in Witchfinder General, and he was in a few other horror films of the time, like And Now the Screaming Starts, I think is one of his. He wasn't bad. He was the guy that went on to become Simon Templar in The Return of the Saint, if that rings any bells with anyone. And there were some nice artistic flourishes in this film. For example, when someone encounters the vampire, there's a sort of feeling of time freezing, and the actual image freezes for a few seconds. The stream stops running and freezes. I thought that was quite cool. And there was also some good stuff. For example, at the end there's a big sword fight, and there's one part where the sword fight goes behind stuff, and you actually see the shadows on the wall, on a bright blue wall, of the guys fighting. It looks really good, and the actual fighting's quite good in this. I liked it. I like this film, and it's a shame it flopped, I think, because it was just dated, I guess. And also probably the non-charisma of the lead didn't help. But it had some great concepts in it, and I think this is one of those few films that could actually be really brilliant as a remake in this day and age, where these vampire hunters that... I think the concept was these guys actually moved across space and time. So they went wherever there was evil, and it wasn't necessarily just vampires, they would fight it. So it's kind of like a swashbuckling Doctor Who type. You know, there was Kronos, there was his assistant who was a hunchback called Professor Grost. He also had Caroline Munro was the girl kind of helping, but he actually left her behind in this, at the end of this. But I got a feeling if they'd have made another one, she'd have been in it as well. It was good fun. I really quite enjoyed this film. I'd say a good double bill for this would probably... I came up with two for this. It kind of reminded me of the Hulk the Slayer. So I was wondering, is it a bit like that? Would it make a double bill with that? So I considered that for a bit, but then I'll change my mind. I think this would go quite well with Roman Polanski's Hammer, stroke satire, which was called Dance of the Vampires. Or... it's called Dance of the Vampires in the UK. It was also called The Fearless Vampire Killers, I think, in America. I think it also went by the title something like My Teeth in Your Neck, or something like that. And one of the reasons I think it would make a good pairing with that is the guy who's Captain Kronos actually looks a bit... He's like a good-looking version of Roman Polanski. So that'd be kind of... it'd go together. Anyway, overall I like this film. I'd give it 65 out of 100. Good fun. Enjoyed it. Hour and a half just shoots by watching this, and my score is kind of similar to IMDb, which I think is 6.7 out of 10, so very close to that. Good watch. Certainly one that good Sunday afternoon view, I think. Overall, I recommend this one. And I'd say it was odd. Okay then, bye. You can visit us at our website www.thegoodthebadandtheodd.com, or you can leave us feedback on info@thegoodthebadandtheodd.com. Any feedback you leave will be greatly appreciated, and we should be sure to mention you. We'd also very much like any iTunes reviews.